Modern Indian History lecture series. Today I'll be speaking about the consequences of the revolt of 1857. In the last lecture we had discussed about the course of the revolt of 1857, and today we'll be speaking about what are the consequences of the revolt of 1857. The revolt of 1857 had larger implications for Indian history, Indian polity, Indian society, and even when we think from our contemporary perspective, I think it's very important to know about the consequences of the 1857 revolt. So we will start our lecture. The consequences of the revolt of 1857 can be broadly listed under these headings, that is the political and administrative changes, religious and social policy shifts, financial and economic consequences, racialization process, and military reorganization. So these are the things that happened after the revolt of 1857. So we'll start with the political and administrative changes. So the most fundamental thing that happened after the revolt of 1857 is that the center of power had shifted from the English East India Company to the British Crown. So you see a direct transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown. The British Crown became the center of power. They were directly administering Indian territory, and you see the implementation of the Government of India Act of 1858. The Government of India Act of 1858 is very important because it legitimized the transfer of power from East India Company to English Crown. And you see that the Secretary of State is a very important position within the British cabinet. The Secretary of State is assuming the most important power. And you see that when the East India Company was ruling, the board of directors and the board of control and the court of directors, they were having more important power in deciding policy matters. But what you see after the shift of power in 1857, the direct control is with the Secretary of State, who is from the British cabinet, and of course, till 1857, the center of power in India was Governor General. So this Governor General is shifting to Viceroy. Viceroy is becoming more prominent. He is the direct representative of the British Crown in India. He is the representative of British Crown in India, Viceroy, and Secretary of State. These two important positions are assuming more power after 1857 revolt. And you see the Queen's proclamation being passed in 1858 along with the Government of India Act, because this initiates the beginning of the Queen rule. Queen, the English Queen, is directly administering the whole of Indian territory. And one more important constituent of Queen's proclamation is that the idea of equality before law. Everyone should be treated equally under the British law. So you see that India is being directly administered by the British Crown or the Queen. So these are some political changes that are happening. Along with that, there are some other political changes. We had spoken about the doctrine of lapse in the first lecture, where the English East India Company is acquiring the territories of Indian princes who don't have natural heirs or natural sons. They were continuously occupying certain territories like that. So after 1857 revolt created fear among the British territory or the British Crown that if they continue with this policy, this will create even more fear, this will create even more resistance among the Indians. They were fearing about that, and because of that they completely abolished or did away with the idea of doctrine of lapse, because through doctrine of lapse they were acquiring lots of territories. But even though they abolished doctrine of lapse, what we see is that the Indian princes still had to be subordinate to the British Crown. So it means that they were favoring in some way to the Indians, but they were not fully favoring. Ultimately the power rested on the British, but they were making some small concession to the Indians by abolishing doctrine of lapse, because the trauma of 1857 revolt was very much there in their minds. And one important political and administrative change that happened is that they are introducing the Indian Civil Service, which is of course the historical precedent of the present day Indian administrative service. So they are creating this idea of Indian Civil Service after the 1857 revolt. And through Indian Civil Service, what they are actually targeting, they are planning to create a class of loyal bureaucrats. They are planning to create a class of loyal bureaucrats. So because 1857 was an act of resistance, they had to pacify the subject population of Indians. So they created this class of Indian civil servants. They introduced an examination system through which they aimed that they could create a class of bureaucrats who would be loyal. So in a sense, they are giving some position of power to Indians within the bureaucracy. Not just that, in 1861, they are introducing the Indian Councils Act. So Indian Councils Act is a Viceroy's council. So Viceroy will be making decisions, ultimate decisions. But then Indians were given nomination within the council, the Viceroy's councils. But Indians are not elected. It's not elected power, they are being nominated. So which means that Indians are being given some positions of power. So this is a tactic of appeasement or pacification. The main reason is that Indians had to be pacified, they shouldn't resist. So you see the idea of pacification. And why I am telling these points is because these points are very important to know about the beginnings of Indian nationalist movement. Because this can be directly connected to the beginnings of Indian nationalist movement. That is why it's very important to know about the consequences of the revolt of 1857. So next we'll speak about the religious and social policy shifts. We discussed about the political and administrative changes. What were the religious and social policy changes that they implemented, the British Crown? The first and foremost thing is non-interference in religious matters, because we discussed in the first lecture that the British East India Company was constantly interfering in the religious matters of upper caste Hindus who were mostly in the military. We discussed about the cartridge issue. We discussed about how the English East India Company implemented the abolition of sati, which kind of triggered the Indians very much. Also one important thing is there, Widow Remarriage Act, which was implemented in 1856. So Widow Remarriage Act gave rights to the widows to remarry, which was against Indian customs and Indian beliefs. So Widow Remarriage Act was one of the major reasons which kind of triggered the Indians to protest or resist against the British East India Company in 1857. So one of the prominent areas where they made this religious change is that they slowed down the process of Widow Remarriage Act. They didn't completely implement the Widow Remarriage Act. So they were trying to appeal to the Indian customs and religions. They were not really interfering in Indian religious feelings and customs. That is one of the areas. And within the social sphere, what they did is that they allied with the zamindars, princes, landlords. Because in the first lecture we discussed that the zamindars, the princes, the landlords, they had resisted against the British East India Company. So the English Crown is trying to make this appeasement strategy where they are trying to please the zamindars, the princes and the landlords so that these people won't resist. And in fact, during the nationalist movement, we see that the zamindars, princes and the landlords had sometimes sided with the British Crown. So it's an appeasement strategy. When we discuss about consequences of 1857 revolt, one of the important things that we need to discuss is the appeasement strategy that they were trying to do. I will write here appeasement strategy. It will be discussed in the conclusion part also. So this is very important to know about the early phase of Indian nationalism. The religious and social policy shifts. So we discussed about the administrative and political shifts. In the sphere of religion and society, the British Crown made some changes. Because in the earlier versions, what we see is that the English East India Company had interfered in the religious beliefs of upper caste Hindus who were mostly there among the sepoys. We discussed about the cartridge issue in the first slide, first presentation, the idea of how they stuffed cow fat and pig fat and which triggered the religious sentiments of Hindus and Muslims in the army. We also discussed how the English East India Company had abolished practices such as sati, which the upper caste Hindus thought that it's an infringement of their religious beliefs. Likewise, we see that the English crown is not interfering in the religious customs of the Hindus. And it is very much evident in the Widow Remarriage Act, because in 1856 you see that the English East India Company is implementing the Widow Remarriage Act, which was against the Hindu beliefs and customs. But after the shift of power, they are not much applying the idea of Widow Remarriage Act. They are trying to appease the Indians. And that is why I will discuss about the idea of appeasement strategy. Because all across this process of consequences of 1857 revolt, we see the process of appeasement strategy that the English crown is trying to implement. And this is mainly to get their favors, their loyalty. And it can be seen even within the social sphere. The appeasement strategy can be seen within the social sphere as well. Because you see that until then, the zamindars, the princes, the landlords, they had resisted against the English East India Company during the 1857 revolt. But after 1857 revolt, when the power was shifted, you see the English crown siding with the zamindars, the princes and the landlords. And that is why during the nationalist movement, the zamindars, princes and landlords are showing that loyalty to English crown. They are not fiercely resisting English crown during the mainstream nationalist movement. And that is why we need to understand these appeasement strategies. It is very important to understand these appeasement strategies that the English crown was doing in India. Now we will discuss about the economic and financial consequences, political, social and religious, and economic and financial consequences. Along with appeasement strategy, there was something called contempt. Contempt and appeasement strategy. The meaning of contempt is exactly opposite to appeasement. So British Crown was not entirely doing appeasement strategy after 1857 revolt. There were versions of contempt as well. And it was reflected in the economic and financial situation of India after 1857 revolt. We discussed that one of the major factors of the major causes of the 1857 revolt were the economic causes, the deindustrialization process, how the Indian industries were collapsed due to the intervention of English East India Company. But you don't see a change in the policy, in the economic policy of British Crown. So here they are not showing that appeasement when it comes to the economic dimension. You see that the economic situation is still very bad. It's continuing in a very bad shape. That is why we see the process of deindustrialization, which we will discuss in the next lecture also. Deindustrialization, how Indian industries were completely collapsed by the policies of British Crown. It's continuing. It was started by English East India Company, but that process is continuing even after the revolt of 1857. And you still see that the British manufactured goods are getting more prominence. So on the economic front, you see that the British is showing no appeasement towards Indians. There they are showing a policy of contempt. Because you see the British industry is only growing. Indian handicrafts are still declining after 1857 revolt. So you don't see much change in the economic front. Not just that, they were introducing new taxes also. Until then they had introduced lots of oppressive taxation systems like permanent settlement and all. But then they are introducing new taxes which is creating even more difficulties for the peasants. Who are the most affected people? The peasants, the tenants. Because I told you the English crown is siding with the zamindars, the landlords. But then the conditions of the tenants or the peasants are very much miserable. And why it is important? It's because in the later nationalist phase, we'll see people like Dadabhai Naoroji speaking about deindustrialization, drain of wealth, which we'll be discussing in the next lecture series. In the first presentation, we had discussed about Awadh, evidently discussed about Awadh, the Talukdars in Awadh. The Talukdars had actually resisted against the British East India Company during the 1857 revolt. But what we see after 1857 revolt is that the talukdars are also becoming loyal. They had resisted against English East India Company. They are also becoming loyal to the British Crown. Because you see that actually the English East India Company had confiscated the territories of these talukdars, especially in Awadh. We discussed about Awadh in the first lecture series. But what we see is that the British Crown is restoring the lands of many of these talukdars. So these talukdars are happy, they are siding with the British. But who are the ones who are getting affected? The peasants. The peasants and tenants' concerns are not getting addressed. They are still in misery. And that is why in the later phase of 19th century you see lots of peasant movements that are happening. And because of these peasant movements, the English Crown is forced to pass the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885. And Bengal Tenancy Act is an act that is showing some favors towards the peasants. Again, the strategy of appeasement, but not fully. Next, we will discuss about another consequence, the racialization process. What we see before 1880, 1857, you don't see, of course, racialization was there, but after 1857 created a mixture of trauma. As I told you in the beginning, it created a traumatic feeling among the Englishmen. As we discussed in the second lecture series, lots of British women and men also were killed. So it had created a mixture of fear and anger among the Englishmen towards the Indians. Fear was there, because of the fear they are using these appeasement strategies, but it was mixed with anger towards Indians. And that is why after 1857 we see a significant amount of racialization, racial contempt that the British had towards Indians. And you see that these racial distinctions between English and Indians are getting more and more hard. They started suspecting the Indians. Even though they were appeasing the Indians, they were also suspecting the Indians who were in positions of power. 1858, they made something called Peel Commission. And there's something which is connected to the racial contempt. Racial contempt. Racial contempt of English towards Indians was reflected very much in the military reorganization. So military is getting reorganized because we discussed in the first two lectures that the triggering point of the 1857 revolt, the upper caste Hindus, they were the ones who were prominently resisting against the British. Upper caste Hindus among the soldiers, they were the ones who were resisting against the British. But what we see is that they are reorganizing the military because they have the fear towards the upper caste Hindus. They are actually favoring a new recruitment system where the Sikhs, the Pathans and the Gurkhas, who are considered to be more manly, more masculine, they are being recruited into the British military. And it's believed that the Sikhs, Pathans and Gurkhas will show that loyalty towards the English crown. On the other hand, because of the fear towards upper caste Hindus and their acts of disloyalty, most of the upper caste Hindus were removed from these positions. And you see these people are being constituted within the military. Coming back to the racialization component, because we discussed about racial contempt, you see the Peel Commission, which actually reorganized the military setup. We see that until then Indians also could possess arms, but after this Peel Commission, which was introduced by Jonathan Peel, you see that Indians couldn't possess much arms, including artillery, and you see that the number of Europeans were increased in the army, and Europeans possessed artillery and Indians couldn't control many of the artillery products, and Enfield rifles, the controversial Enfield rifles or the cartridge issue that we discussed in the first lecture, the Enfield rifles couldn't be controlled by the Indians. So here also you see a racialization component. The Britishers are dominating or controlling the arms and Indians couldn't control the arms. There is an element of racial contempt that is connected to military reorganization. Not just that, there's another thing. Until then, the army was organized in such a way that it was based on caste groups. You see Hindus, upper caste Hindus coming together as a group. Within, there will be various regiments, and within a regiment it will be composed of only upper caste men. So that caste sentiment is there, right? So when the caste solidarity is there, they will resist. But what is happening after Peel Commission or the military reorganization is that many of these castes are mixed. Different ethnic groups are mixed. So if it's mixed, then there won't be any idea of caste solidarity. Not just that, another area where this racial contempt was very much evident was when Arms Act was introduced in 1878. When the Arms Act was introduced in 1878, Indians couldn't possess any arms at all. All the arms had to be possessed by the Britishers. So you see a racial divide even within the military reorganization. Europeans could possess arms. Indians couldn't possess arms at all. Another area where this racial contempt was evident, which was a consequence of 1857 revolt, is the Vernacular Press Act, which was implemented in 1878. Because we are also discussing the long-term consequences of the 1857 revolt, not just the short-term consequences. That is why I am extending it to 1878. Vernacular Press Act in 1878 is very important, because what we see is that after 1857, I told you that Indians are given some, due to this appeasement strategy, Indians are given some positions of power. They are being nominated in the Legislative Council. There is an ICS system introduced. So a reading and writing community is created among the Indians, and they are evolving as a middle class, and they are becoming loyal to the Britishers. But what we see is that as a consequence of it, they are also writing, they are also starting vernacular newspapers in regional languages. And you see that the racial contempt that the Indians experienced due to the Britishers, they are writing in the vernacular newspapers because they are feeling that racial inferiority from the British. And you see an educated Indian middle class forming among this public, Indian public. So due to this racial inferiority, they are showing that anger or criticism against the British Crown in the vernacular newspapers or the regional newspapers. And what we see as a result of it, and this is a long-term consequence of the 1857 revolt, not a short-term consequence, is that they are implementing an act called Vernacular Press Act. So in Vernacular Press Act, the British Crown is again fearing the Indians. They are anticipating another revolt like 1857, because Indians are constantly writing in vernacular or regional newspapers against the British Crown because of that racial inferiority. And you see that an act was implemented, Vernacular Press Act. After Vernacular Press Act, what we see is that the regional newspapers or vernacular newspapers, before they start publishing their news items, it had to be thoroughly scrutinized, thoroughly read. After that only they can publish it, because they are fearing. If Indians write against the British, they are fearing. So only after complete search and scrutiny only they can publish their articles. That was the main provision of Vernacular Press Act of 1878. But on the other side, on the flip side, English newspapers couldn't be stopped, because many of the Indians, they were writing mostly in regional languages. They were more comfortable in regional languages. But you see that English newspapers can publish anything. So here also that racial divide is there. Like the military aspect, you see English possessing privileges and Indians not possessing privileges. And this is a consequence of 1857 revolt. However, you see that the governor, the Viceroy Lord Ripon, about whom we will be discussing in later lecture series, under his, when he was Viceroy only, this act was repealed, taken away. We will discuss about that much later. Another aspect where this racialization was more prominent, and which is a long-term consequence of 1857 revolt, is the Ilbert Bill controversy of 1883. So we discussed about Viceroy Lord Ripon, the last slide. So under Viceroy Lord Ripon, a new rule was instituted. So until then, the British subjects and the European subjects, including the non-official British and European subjects who committed crimes, they couldn't be tried by Indian judges. Only Europeans and British judges could try the European or British subjects who committed crimes. But after, when Viceroy Lord Ripon took charge, Ilbert Bill spoke about the idea that British subjects and European subjects, including the non-official ones who committed crimes, could be tried by Indian judges as well. Because as I told you, you see a middle class emerging among the Indians and they are occupying important positions. It can be connected to the Indian Councils Act, it can be connected to ICS exams. So you see that they are occupying important positions. So Viceroy Lord Ripon was much more generous, humane. Because of that he implemented this policy, but then it created lots of uproar or resistance among the British and European subjects, especially the non-officials. They were very much angry with this policy, and you see that even though this policy was implemented, due to the pressure, constant pressure of the non-official European and British subjects, this act, this bill was completely revoked. That is why it is known as Ilbert Bill controversy. And here also you see a dimension of racialization, which is also an effect, a long-term effect of 1857 mutiny. Because you see that the British are showing and Europeans are showing that contempt towards Indians. They don't want to be tried by Indian judges. So you see that drift and friction between the Britishers and Indians. And in fact, you see that the Ilbert Bill controversy, which later on favored the British subjects and British or European subjects, created the nationalist sentiment, because Indians were generally getting angry with this racial contempt that is happening. It was one of the major factors which triggered the later nationalist movement. This could be connected to the long-term consequence of 1857 revolt. So we will come to a conclusion or analysis of this whole lecture. As I told you, two things are very important when we discuss about the consequences of 1857 revolt: the strategies of appeasement and expressions of contempt. Strategies of appeasement and expressions of contempt. These two things are happening after 1857 revolt. And I have given a summary of whatever we discussed during this lecture. That is how the British Crown is trying to appease the princes, the landlords, the zamindars, the talukdars, how they are trying to nominate certain Indians in the legislative council, how they are trying to create the ICS or Indian civil service where Indians are being installed. So this strategy of appeasement, because of the fear of Indians resisting. So it's a strategy, not that they are favoring Indians. It's a strategy, it's a political strategy to appease the Indians because of the fear of resistance. Because as I told you, it created that trauma. And even within military, they are creating this strategy of appeasement. However, the idea, the expressions of contempt is becoming more evident in the domain of racialization. This is very important when we discuss the consequence of 1857 revolt, which we don't quite often discuss. And this racialization was something that prevailed along with the economic misery of the tenants. These two are the areas where the English crown didn't appease. There they showed contempt after the revolt of 1857. So it means that the English crown was not a crown which was so humane, so generous, because under their policy they say everybody is equal before law. But was everybody equal before law when it comes to application? No, it was not. That is why they were showing that racial contempt. That is why the peasants and tenants were still suffering. Actually, the strategy of appeasement only worked among the middle class, the higher class, the landlords. But you see the same middle class revolting, resisting through the nationalist movement in much later phase. but then that racial contempt and economic disregard is something we need to address, because this was definitely the beginning of national movement. Because when it comes to the economic difficulties, as I told you, Indian industries were still collapsed and peasants were in a difficult situation, the draining of Indian wealth. Because one important thing is that 1857 revolt created huge loss for Britain, and those losses had to be corrected, those losses had to be recovered, and for recovering those losses, Indians only had to pay for those losses. And that is why you see the drain of wealth, which the great nationalist Dadabhai Naoroji later on explains during the nationalist phase, is becoming more and more deeper. So what do you arrive out of the consequence of 1857 revolt is that consequences of 1857 revolt is the benchmark or the stepping stone of the nationalist movement. That is the important thing, and we should see the consequence of 1857 revolt not as short term consequence but as long term consequence, because then only we will understand Indian history, then only we will understand modern Indian history, then only we can appreciate the nationalist movement. With this I will end my lecture. I will actually show two questions which came in the UPSC 2014 prelims and 2013 prelims, which is connected to the consequences of 1857 revolt. The first question is, what were the object or objects of the Queen Victoria's proclamation 1858? We discussed in the first slide. So you can choose one or two options. The first option is to disclaim any intention to annex Indian states, to place Indian administration under the British Crown, to regulate East India Company's trade with India. So the answers for this question is, the first two options are the answers for this question. It came in 2014 prelims. And the second question is about Ilbert Bill. It came in 2013 prelims. The Ilbert Bill controversy was related to the A, imposition of certain restrictions to carry arms by Indians, B, imposition of restrictions on newspapers in Indian languages, 3, removal of disqualifications on Indian magistrates trying Europeans, and 4th, removal of a duty on imported cotton cloth. The answer is 3, and for the first one it is 1 and 2. In the next history lecture series, we will discuss about the rise of nationalist movement, because the consequences of the revolt of 1857, as I told you, is the beginning of the rise of the nationalist movement. Thank you so much.